Good morning. This is meteorologist Quincy Vagel with your morning severe weather chase briefing for Monday, May 27th, Memorial Day 2019. And there's several areas to look at. Timing afternoon through early evening, mainly across the plains and Midwest, with a threat for all severe hazards. Now, if there's one good thing, it's that we should not see nearly as much flooding today as previous days, even though there was some heavy rain earlier today and then overnight. But for today, there's really a couple different areas. There's a certain target, or a fairly certain target, across the central high plains, and then also another one across the Midwest, especially central to eastern Iowa, northern Illinois, into northeastern Missouri. A more conditional target across the dry line in the central to southern plains, which is pretty interesting. In the upper levels, cutoff low is slowly moving, pinwheeling across the west toward the Four Corners region. So there's some relatively strong upper level winds that will be impinging on the central to southern plains, and then also a little bit of a secondary area across the Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast. And just to look kind of at a broad map, there'll be the most instability will be along and ahead of the dry line into the Midwest, and it's really focused on Kansas, which I'll get to in a little bit here. But for the surface map, this is forecast her around mid-afternoon. Surface low in northeastern Colorado, dry line moving east across the plains, a frontal boundary across Nebraska, and then a warm front, which would be another thing to look at closely across portions of Iowa, Illinois, and then into Indiana. But across the dry line in Kansas is where I'm really interested. This reminds me a little bit of May 17th of this year, where models showed just a tiny possibility of dryline initiation. But if any storms were able to initiate today along the dry line, especially in west central Kansas into possibly northwestern Oklahoma, the forecast soundings show an absolutely favorable setup for supercells with all hazards, including tornadoes. But this is pretty conditional. And if you look at point forecast soundings up and down the dry line, the HRRR is showing that the convective temperature is very close to getting breached. We're talking about only about 2 or 3 degrees off, so it's only going to be a slight difference. If it heats up just a couple of degrees above forecast, then you could have isolated supercells up and down the dry line. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And if we look at the SREF, it's increased the probabilities the last couple of runs. This map basically just shows where there's substantial instability, substantial shear, but also a probability or a potential for convective initiation. The percentages are fairly low, but 5 to 10% up and down from Kansas into, well, far western Oklahoma and then even northwest Texas. So something to look out for. It's one of those targets where I don't want to say it's exactly 50-50, but it's almost a toss-up. You could get an intense supercell along the dry line, or maybe a couple of them, or you might not get anything. It's one of those kind of sleeper targets where maybe if you get out there and chase, you could get a little bit lucky. So we'll see about that. The most certain target is really going to be across the central high plains from northeastern Colorado into portions of Nebraska and maybe far southeastern Wyoming. But the thing is, up here, it looks like there's not a lot of instability, so it's going to be really driven by wind shear, and then you get some terrain circulations northeast of Denver. And for the HREF, the UH tracks, it does show a pretty strong clustering in the central high plains. Now, it's mainly a hail threat, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few tornadoes as well. The HREF is not really picking up on anything along the dry line. If you look really closely, there's a couple of specks there in Kansas and then the eastern Texas panhandle, and then another little cluster south of Fort Stockton yet again. But a big clustering across really the Illinois and the surrounding parts of the Midwest, which is probably my main focus today. If we run through the NCAR UH tracks, it picks up on stuff in eastern Iowa relatively early in the afternoon, and then some really impressive tracks across Illinois. And then also, then you get later in the afternoon and then into early evening, you get those clustering across the Nebraska panhandle, western Nebraska, and maybe far southeastern Wyoming. But looking more at the Midwest threat, this is the forecast mean low-level jet at 21Z, and it's already on the order of 20 to 25 knots coming into eastern Iowa and northern Illinois, and that's really going to drive this potential event. Now, we are watching convection this morning, and assuming that breaks apart, you should see redevelopment along the southern or southwestern flank of that convection. And the HRRR for several runs in a row, and this has some support from other models as well, is showing discrete or semi-discrete supercells moving from Iowa into northern Illinois. And the kinematic environment will absolutely favor supercells. We should have a westerly component at 500 millibar, the southwesterly low-level jet, and then near-surface winds around south. So plenty of directional shear. There should be substantial instability as well. So storms that develop either in the warm sector or right near that warm front are going to have that elevated threat for tornadoes. Just to recap, severe threat this afternoon through this evening across a pretty broad area, plains and Midwest, with all hazards possible, but the main focused areas would be the central high plains in the Midwest. But keep an eye on the dry line. It's conditional, but there could be some storms there as well. So thanks for watching. If you have any feedback, let me know.